The gym door creaked open. Bruce Lee stepped inside, his canvas bag slung casually over his shoulder. No fanfare, no dramatic entrance. Just another man walking into the gym, blending in with the noise of clanking weights and grunting powerlifters. A loud laugh echoed across the room. Bruce's eyes flicked toward the sound. At the bench press station, a mountain of muscle was lifting with reckless abandon, his arms bulging with every press. He set the bar down with a heavy thud, then looked up and smirked. "You're way too small to fight anyone," he called out, his voice booming across the gym. The gym went silent for a second. A few heads turned, the murmurs from nearby lifters fading into a hushed curiosity. The man speaking was Chuck Norris, already a known name in the martial arts world. He wasn't just a bodybuilder, he was a fighter. He'd already made a name for himself in karate, his reputation growing among the most serious competitors. Tall, imposing, and incredibly strong, Norris was a force to be reckoned with. But Bruce Lee? He was still a newcomer to some, a man whose style and philosophy had yet to be fully understood. Chuck's gaze flicked from Bruce's slight frame to his own muscular arms, then back again. His expression was one of pure amusement. To him, Bruce was an anomaly, a man who barely seemed to fit in the world of raw strength and power. Chuck had spent years honing his technique, testing his strength against the toughest opponents in the world. But this little man? He couldn't possibly be a real threat. Bruce didn't flinch. He didn't react to Chuck's taunt. He simply stepped further into the gym, his movements deliberate, his presence undeniable. His reputation preceded him, but it wasn't the size of his body that made Bruce dangerous. It was the mastery of his mind, the precision of his technique, and the fluidity of his movements. The other lifters, who had been focusing on their sets, now turned their attention fully to Bruce. They could feel the tension in the air, the anticipation that something was about to unfold, something that had nothing to do with muscle and everything to do with skill. Chuck, still amused, wiped his hands on the towel draped over his shoulder and made his way over to Bruce. The contrast between them was staggering. Norris was over 6 feet tall, built like a statue, his muscles rippling with each movement. Bruce, on the other hand, stood at just 5'7", weighing no more than 135 pounds soaking wet. Yet, despite the physical disparity, there was a quiet confidence in Bruce's gaze that sent an unspoken challenge rippling through the gym. "You here to show us something, little man?" Chuck asked, a grin spreading across his face. Bruce met his gaze, eyes calm, unbothered by the taunt. "No," Bruce replied evenly, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "I'm here to show you something." Chuck's grin faltered for a split second. The gym's atmosphere shifted, the air crackling with potential for something big. Bruce Lee wasn't backing down. In fact, it almost seemed like he was inviting the challenge, but with a coolness that was unsettling to Chuck. The crowd of lifters, powerlifters, and martial artists gathered around, their eyes locked on the two men. There was a mix of disbelief and curiosity. What was happening here? Was this some kind of joke? Or was Bruce Lee really going to take on Chuck Norris, the undisputed heavyweight in the gym? "All right, little man," Chuck said, a hint of irritation creeping into his voice. He stepped forward, his massive frame seeming to block the light around Bruce. "You think you've got what it takes to challenge me? You think you're a real fighter?" Bruce didn't respond immediately. He stood there still, his body relaxed but alert. Every muscle in his body was ready. But there was no tension in his posture, no aggression in his expression. Bruce Lee wasn't a man who relied on sheer strength or brute force. His weapon was precision, technique, and the ability to read his opponent in ways they couldn't even imagine. Bruce finally spoke, his words measured. "What do you believe it takes to fight?" Chuck laughed, the sound ringing through the gym. It wasn't the laugh of a man who was intimidated. It was the laugh of a man who thought he already knew everything about fighting. To him, size was everything. He'd sparred with legends, trained with the best, and faced opponents who had pushed him to his limits. Bruce Lee, in his eyes, was just a blip on the radar. "I believe it takes strength, power, and size," Chuck said confidently. "Mass creates power. You can't argue with physics." Bruce nodded slowly. "You're right," he said. "Mass does create power, but that's not all there is to fighting. The crowd fell silent, sensing that this wasn't just a verbal back and forth. This was something more. Bruce wasn't just talking about philosophy or technique, he was laying the groundwork for something deeper. And Chuck, for the first time, wasn't sure what was coming next. "You've got mass," Bruce continued. "But that doesn't mean you can move with it." Chuck raised an eyebrow. "What's that supposed to mean?" Bruce stepped forward, just a fraction of an inch closer to Chuck. His eyes locked onto his opponent's, his movements fluid and calm. "It means you can't fight without understanding how force moves through the body. Size doesn't mean anything if you can't harness the energy within." Chuck's smile faded, his jaw tightening. The cocky confidence he had exuded moments earlier was now replaced by something else. Curiosity, maybe even doubt. "You think you're faster than me?" Chuck asked, his voice no longer carrying the same arrogance. "You think your little punches can hurt me?" Bruce didn't answer directly. Instead, he shifted his weight, his body aligning itself with a subtle, graceful fluidity that made Chuck's posture look rigid in comparison. "Not faster," Bruce said, "just more efficient." Chuck stepped back, his massive legs flexing beneath him as he prepared to demonstrate his power. He squared his shoulders and lunged, throwing a punch that was meant to test Bruce's defenses. His movement was fast, his strength undeniable. But Bruce was ready. Without a second thought, Bruce slid to the side, his body moving like water. Chuck's fist passed through the air where Bruce had been just a moment ago, missing him by inches. The gym gasped. Chuck froze. He'd missed. It was subtle, so subtle that it almost seemed like the punch had simply evaporated. Bruce hadn't blocked it. He hadn't tried to stop it. He had just moved. "You missed," Bruce said calmly, his voice carrying through the silence. Chuck stared at him, his mind racing to process what had just happened. The crowd, too, was stunned. What had they just witnessed? A move so quick, so precise, it didn't even seem like Bruce had to try. Chuck narrowed his eyes. "All right, little man, let's see what you've really got." And with that, the challenge was on. The gym was silent now. The flickering lights overhead and the occasional clang of weights in the distance were the only sounds breaking the tension. Everyone was watching. Every eye in the room was locked on Bruce and Chuck, waiting for the next move. Chuck stood there, fists clenched, muscles rippling under the fluorescent lights. His confidence had returned, but there was something different now, an edge of uncertainty. He hadn't expected Bruce to slip past him so effortlessly. To Chuck, it was almost like Bruce hadn't been there at all. It wasn't just speed he had to worry about. It was something deeper, something more elusive. He had to test it, had to prove to himself that he wasn't just seeing things. Bruce wasn't just a small man, not by any stretch. But Chuck had the power. He had the size, and that was supposed to be enough. So, why had Bruce made it look so easy? Chuck squared up again, taking a step forward. He had every intention of throwing a punch that would land. This time he wasn't going to hold back. "You're fast," Chuck admitted. "I'll give you that, but fast don't win fights." Bruce didn't respond. His posture was relaxed, almost casual. His hands were loose at his sides. His weight balanced perfectly. There was no tension in his body, no telltale sign of what was coming next. To the untrained eye, it looked like Bruce was waiting. But anyone who knew how to fight would recognize it. Bruce wasn't waiting for Chuck to attack. He was waiting for the right moment. Chuck's eyes narrowed, and with a sudden burst of speed, he lunged forward again. His fist shot out, cutting through the air like a missile. It was a textbook punch, powerful, direct, and aimed at Bruce's head. But once again, Bruce was gone. He slid to the side, effortlessly evading the punch, his body moving like water flowing around an obstacle. The punch missed by mere inches, but it was enough. Chuck stumbled forward, thrown off balance by the force of his own attack. Bruce didn't let up. He didn't need to. He wasn't trying to win the fight with brute force. He was just waiting for Chuck to tire himself out, to show his hand, to reveal his weaknesses. Chuck gritted his teeth and turned, his body tense with frustration. His pride was on the line now. "What's the matter, Bruce?" he called out, his voice tinged with irritation. "Scared to fight me? Scared I'll break you in half?" Bruce didn't answer, not with words. Instead, he moved again, this time faster, more decisively. Chuck barely had time to react before Bruce was right in front of him, just inches away. He could feel Bruce's presence, almost like an electric charge in the air. Without warning, Bruce raised his hand, not in a fist but in a fluid, controlled motion. He placed his palm against Chuck's chest, pressing gently. It wasn't a punch, it wasn't a strike, but it was enough to make Chuck's whole world stop. The room seemed to hold its breath. The crowd was frozen, unsure of what they were seeing. Bruce's palm was barely touching Chuck's massive chest, yet the effect was immediate. Chuck's body lurched backward as if struck by an invisible force. His massive frame staggered, his eyes wide with disbelief. He took a few unsteady steps back, his hands instinctively reaching for the weight rack to steady himself. What the hell just happened? Bruce remained perfectly still, his hand returning to his side. He didn't show any triumph, no smug grin. He simply observed. Chuck's breathing was ragged now, his chest heaving as he tried to process what had just occurred. His body felt like it was on fire, but there were no visible injuries, no bruises. It was as if Bruce had hit him in a place that couldn't be seen, a place his muscles couldn't protect. Size and power. Bruce's voice cut through the silence like a knife. It's not about size. It's about precision. It's about understanding where the force needs to go. Chuck's hand pressed against his chest, his mind racing. He couldn't explain what he had just felt. His body, built and honed for years of training, had just been completely undone. A flick of Bruce's wrist, a slight push, and Chuck had felt like he was being thrown back by an unseen wave of force. The crowd murmured, their eyes darting between Bruce and Chuck, waiting for the next move. They had never seen anything like this before. Bruce Lee wasn't just dodging punches, he was controlling the fight with an almost supernatural calm. Chuck stood there, his eyes locked on Bruce, but his thoughts were a whirlwind. He had trained with some of the best, sparred with top athletes, but nothing had prepared him for this. Nothing had prepared him for Bruce's ability to control the flow of energy, to move with such grace and speed that it was impossible to catch him. Chuck shook his head, trying to refocus, but Bruce was already moving again. This time, there was no hesitation, no waiting for Chuck to make his move. Bruce flowed toward him, his body shifting through space with ease. In an instant, he was right in front of Chuck, moving with such fluidity that it almost seemed like he wasn't touching the ground. "Let's test your theory," Bruce said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Chuck barely had time to react before Bruce's hand shot out again, faster than anything Chuck could process. But this time, Bruce didn't push. He didn't nudge. Instead, Bruce's palm struck Chuck's chest with such force that it felt like a bullet had been fired. The sound was sharp, a crack that echoed through the gym. Chuck's eyes went wide. He felt his chest cave in for a split second, then he stumbled backward, his legs giving way beneath him. It wasn't a punch. It wasn't a strike. It was something else, something that bypassed Chuck's muscle, his strength, and hit him at the core of his being. He staggered back, gasping for air, his body still trying to process the impact. The shock was more than physical, it was mental. Chuck had spent his entire life perfecting his strength, his size, his ability to endure. But Bruce had shown him that none of that mattered if you didn't know how to move, how to direct your energy, how to understand the force at play. The gym was dead silent now. Everyone was watching, not just for the outcome of a fight, but for something deeper. Bruce Lee wasn't just proving a point about martial arts. He was showing them a new way of thinking, a new way of fighting, one that didn't rely on strength, but on mastery of the body, the mind, and the space around you. Chuck stood there, his chest still heaving, his eyes locked on Bruce, trying to understand what had just happened. But in his heart, he knew. He knew Bruce hadn't just beaten him physically. He had beaten everything Chuck had ever believed about fighting. Chuck's pride was bruised, but his respect for Bruce Lee was growing. The challenge wasn't over yet, but something had shifted. Bruce wasn't just a fighter, he was a teacher. And Chuck had just become his student. The gym was still. The silence that had descended upon the room felt like an eternity. Bruce stood motionless, his posture calm, his breathing steady. He wasn't celebrating his success, nor was he taunting Chuck. His body was simply at rest, poised in that exact way that seemed to capture the essence of martial arts, the quiet before the storm. Chuck, on the other hand, was still processing what had just happened. His heart pounded in his chest, and his breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to understand the sensation of being hit. Not with fists, not with brute strength, but with something else entirely. There had been no visible force, no punch, no kick, just a single, subtle touch, and then a shocking wave of power coursing through him. He wiped his forehead with the towel hanging around his neck, his mind racing to make sense of it all. He'd sparred with the best, from the mean streets of Dallas to the highest echelons of the martial arts world. But this was different. The very foundation of everything Chuck had ever believed about fighting was starting to crack. And standing before him was the man who had shattered it all in a matter of seconds. "I didn't hit you hard." Bruce's voice broke through the silence. "I hit you precisely." Chuck looked at him, still catching his breath. He couldn't argue with the logic. He could feel it in his chest. That hit, that touch, hadn't been a physical force that his muscle could have absorbed. It had been something more. It had been like being hit from the inside out. His strength hadn't protected him. It hadn't mattered at all. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. How could he explain the confusion, the shock, the burning realization that he had just been outclassed? Bruce took a step closer, but his movements were still effortless, still fluid, like water moving around an obstacle. "Size gives you mass," he said softly. "But mass doesn't mean power. It means resistance. It means weight. It's static. Power is dynamic. It's about energy, understanding how to move it, how to transfer it." Chuck's brow furrowed as he processed Bruce's words. He was beginning to understand, but only just beginning. In his world, power had always been about muscle, about lifting, about force. But here, Bruce was talking about something else, something that transcended what Chuck had spent his life mastering. Chuck was no fool. He could see it now. The way Bruce had moved, the precision in every step, every gesture, every shift in his body. It was like watching a master painter stroke the canvas, every motion serving a purpose, every movement bringing the fight closer to its inevitable end. Bruce wasn't trying to overwhelm Chuck with strength. He wasn't trying to outmuscle him. Bruce Lee was teaching him something else, the art of effortless power. Chuck stepped back, his hands instinctively raised in a more defensive posture. "You keep talking about precision and energy," he said, his voice quieter now, as if the weight of the moment was finally starting to sink in. "But what happens when someone actually lands a punch? When I land a punch, you think your precision can block that?" Bruce's eyes narrowed slightly, but his expression remained calm, unshaken. "What happens when you land a punch?" Bruce repeated as if the words themselves were enough to provoke thought. "When you rely solely on mass and power, you become predictable. Every movement, every strike, every step you take tells your opponent exactly what you're going to do. The body can only do so much to resist that. But precision? It's different." Chuck didn't reply immediately. He was still processing, still reeling from the idea that something as intangible as precision could defeat raw muscle. But he wasn't about to back down. He was Chuck Norris, after all. The very thought that someone like Bruce Lee, so much smaller, could completely outmaneuver him was something he couldn't accept. Without warning, Chuck lunged forward again, faster this time, his powerful legs propelling him toward Bruce with incredible speed. His fist shot out in a wide arc, aiming to land a solid blow, a strike that would send the smaller man sprawling across the gym floor. But Bruce wasn't there. The punch missed by mere inches, the force of it sending Chuck stumbling forward as Bruce had already moved, slipping around him like water flowing through cracks in a dam. Bruce didn't stop. He didn't retreat. He wasn't trying to defend. He simply avoided Chuck's attack, and in doing so, he created the perfect opening. In a fluid motion, Bruce stepped behind Chuck, his footwork like a dancer's, his body perfectly balanced. Before Chuck could even think about reacting, Bruce's hand came up again, not with the intention to strike, but with the same calm precision. His palm pressed gently against Chuck's back, just below the shoulder blades. The effect was immediate. Chuck's massive frame shuddered, his knees buckled, and for a split second, it felt as though the ground beneath him was disappearing. He staggered forward, his hands flailing for balance, his mind struggling to comprehend what was happening to his body. He caught himself on a nearby rack of dumbbells, the weight of his own body making it impossible to steady himself completely. The crowd gasped. The gym, which had been silent moments before, now buzzed with confusion and disbelief. They had seen it. Seen Chuck Norris, the formidable giant, staggered by a man who didn't even seem to be trying. Chuck stood there, panting heavily, one hand still gripping the rack for support. His face was pale, his chest heaving with effort. He wasn't used to feeling vulnerable. He wasn't used to being the one who needed to regain his footing. Bruce didn't move. He didn't chase after the fall. He didn't revel in the moment. His stance remained calm, centered. He looked at Chuck with a quiet patience, his eyes unwavering. "Do you understand now?" Bruce asked, his voice as calm as the ocean. Chuck didn't answer right away. His gaze flickered from Bruce to the floor, his mind still struggling to process what had just happened. He could feel his muscles aching from the strange force, but it wasn't the physical pain that troubled him. It was the realization that he had been outclassed, not in strength, but in understanding. "You didn't use your strength," Chuck said slowly, as if testing the words. "You used something else." Bruce nodded. "Exactly. It's not about strength. It's about understanding where power comes from. It's not about fighting harder. It's about fighting smarter." Chuck looked at him, a flicker of something new in his eyes. It wasn't just respect. It was the beginning of a deeper understanding. "I've been training my whole life," Chuck muttered, "and I thought I knew everything about fighting. But this is different." Bruce took a step forward, his expression softening. "It's not about knowing everything. It's about understanding what you don't know and being willing to learn." Chuck's mind was still reeling. He had spent years building his body, perfecting his technique, but Bruce had shown him something he hadn't even considered. There was a deeper level to fighting, a level that didn't require size or muscle. It required precision, timing, and an understanding of energy. And in that moment, Chuck knew that his journey was far from over. The crowd was still silent, but they were watching, waiting. What they had witnessed wasn't just a fight. It was a lesson that would stay with them long after Bruce and Chuck had left the gym. Chuck took a deep breath, his gaze returning to Bruce. "I want to learn," he said quietly. "Teach me." Bruce didn't smile. He didn't need to. He simply nodded, acknowledging the challenge that had now shifted from combat to education. The gym was still, but the atmosphere had changed. The tension that had once hung in the air like a storm cloud now settled into something else, something quieter, deeper. Chuck Norris, the man who had spent years building his body into a machine of raw power, was no longer the towering figure everyone had feared. In front of him stood Bruce Lee, the man who had just shown him that strength, as he had known it, was only part of the equation. Now Chuck wanted to learn, and Bruce was willing to teach. Bruce turned, his gaze sweeping over the room of lifters, boxers, and martial artists who had gathered to watch. Their faces were a mixture of awe and curiosity, all of them still processing the incredible display they had witnessed. They had come to see a fight, but they had gotten something far more valuable. A lesson in how true strength wasn't measured by muscle mass, but by precision, by intention, and by understanding the way force moved through the body. Chuck took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. His body still felt the aftershock of the touch Bruce had given him. It wasn't pain, but it was something he couldn't quite explain. An energy that had flowed through him, a force that had overwhelmed the sheer mass of his muscles. His hands were still shaking slightly as he wiped his brow with his towel, but his mind was focused now, intent on learning. Bruce, ever the patient teacher, stood calmly, as if he had anticipated this moment. There was no arrogance in his gaze, no smugness at the victory he had just claimed. There was only the quiet resolve of a man who knew exactly how to apply his knowledge, not to defeat others, but to show them a new way. "Show me the 1-inch punch," Chuck said, his voice low and determined. Bruce paused for a moment, his gaze lingering on Chuck's face, gauging his sincerity. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped to the side and walked toward the center of the gym, where a small, unassuming punching bag hung in a corner. He picked up a pair of gloves, but this time he wasn't going to demonstrate his usual moves. Instead, he was going to show Chuck something different. As Bruce adjusted the gloves, the crowd instinctively gathered, a silent buzz of anticipation rising in the room. The lights overhead flickered once more, casting long shadows across the gym floor. The air was thick with the weight of expectation. Chuck followed Bruce, moving with purpose, his massive frame seemingly out of place in the quiet tension of the moment. The crowd stepped back, giving them space, though every pair of eyes was locked on them, waiting to see what would happen next. Bruce turned to face the punching bag, his posture fluid and poised. The gym was still, the world outside seemingly fading into nothingness. For a brief moment, it was just Bruce, the bag and the energy of the room. You want to understand what power really is, Bruce said, his voice cutting through the silence. It's not about throwing the hardest punch. It's about applying the right amount of force at the right moment. Chuck watched closely, but there was still doubt in his eyes. He had seen plenty of punches in his time. He had seen fighters who could knock out their opponents with a single blow. But Bruce wasn't just talking about knockout power. He was talking about something far more precise. Bruce stepped forward, bringing his body into perfect alignment. His feet were shoulder-width apart, his weight balanced evenly between them. His body was still, not a twitch of movement. It was as if he had become part of the space around him, perfectly attuned to the rhythm of the moment. I'm not going to hit this bag with force, Bruce explained. I'm going to hit it with precision. 1 inch. That's all it takes. Chuck's brow furrowed, but he didn't interrupt. He wanted to see. He wanted to understand. Bruce's body shifted, fluid as water, and in the space of a second, his arm shot forward. It wasn't a wind-up. It wasn't a heavy punch. It was a quick, controlled motion that lasted no more than a fraction of a second. The impact was sharp, crisp, and the bag barely moved. Chuck blinked, then stepped forward, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. That's it? He asked, his voice barely audible. You're telling me that's all it takes to generate power? Bruce nodded. It's not the punch. It's the way you move your body. The way you transfer your energy from your feet, through your hips, through your shoulders, and into the point of impact. Power comes from understanding how force moves through you, how to direct it with the smallest movement. Chuck took a step back, trying to process the demonstration. His body, built for power, was trying to reconcile with the concept of power being generated from a single, measured movement. It didn't make sense to him. His entire life, he had relied on the mass of his muscles, the strength in his arms and legs to win fights. But this was something else. Bruce stepped aside, watching Chuck with a calm expression. I've seen men like you before, Chuck, he said. You rely on your body, on your size, and on your strength. But when you rely on size alone, you miss the most important part of the equation. Chuck didn't respond right away. Instead, he moved closer to the punching bag and tried to throw a punch with the same precision Bruce had shown him. His body tensed, his muscles straining, and the bag swayed, but it didn't have the same clean impact Bruce had delivered. He tried again, this time focusing on his form, but still, it didn't feel right. His punches lacked the fluidity, the seamless connection between body and force. He could feel it in his arms, the strain, the effort. This wasn't what Bruce had done. Bruce observed quietly, watching Chuck as he tested his own understanding of the 1-inch punch. You're thinking too hard, Bruce said, almost as if reading Chuck's thoughts. Power isn't something you force, it's something you allow. Chuck paused. Allow, he echoed, his confusion deepening. What do you mean? Bruce smiled, though it wasn't a smile of mockery or superiority. It was the smile of a teacher guiding a student. You're fighting your own body, he explained. You're trying to force something that should flow. When you force it, you resist. When you allow it, it moves freely, and the power comes without you even realizing it. Chuck stood still for a moment, his mind turning over the words. It wasn't about the sheer force of his muscles. It wasn't about how much he could bench or how hard he could punch. It was about letting go, about understanding the rhythm of the body and the energy that flowed through it. It was a philosophy Bruce had spent his entire life developing, a philosophy that defied tradition and broke the boundaries of what people thought they knew about fighting. Bruce stepped toward Chuck, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're stronger than you think, Chuck. You just have to understand how to use what you have." Chuck looked up at Bruce, his eyes wide with a newfound respect. "I want to understand," he said, his voice steady now. "Teach me." Bruce nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile on his face. "Let's start with something simple," he said, his voice calm, his eyes focused. "The body can do things you never thought possible, but only if you stop thinking it has to be hard." Chuck stood taller, a sense of determination settling into his posture. This was only the beginning. The lessons Bruce had started to teach him were not just about fighting. They were about understanding. Understanding his body, his mind, and the very nature of power. And with that, the real journey was just beginning.